Hi folks, it's Dr. Elam. I'm welcoming you to our lecture for week 6's material. I will touch on the Vaith readings from reading between the lines, as well as going over some salient points to my mind in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, Elizabeth Gaskell's Curious If True, and Charles Dickens' The Baron of Grogzwig. The video may jump a little bit as I get my notes together and put this talk together. I'll start briefly by touching on Vaith and say that his chapter on fantasy I think is quite good in understanding where the qualities of fantasy actually express ideas that are congenial to Christianity. In fact, I believe Vaith overtly mentions Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and I highly recommend it. I'm not sure if you can find it on Google. I know that the Tolkien estate has been very uh, um, controlling about what is disseminated on the internet. If you're able to find a public domain version of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, I highly recommend it, especially the epilogue, where Tolkien, after his discussion about the nature of fairy stories, points out that the Gospels themselves embody many of the qualities of fairy tales. Now, by fairy tales, he doesn't mean things that are untrue. He means stories that awaken a sense of anticipation, a sense of hopefulness, that look forward to some sort of reconciliation in narrative. And in the fairy story, this reconciliation often comes at the bleakest moment in the narrative, in the plot. And Tolkien sees that similarity with the gospel being, for him, the ultimate fairy story, the ultimate myth. Again, and not in ways meaning untrue, but in ways meaning these are expressions of the reality of things. In fact, we could think of it as hearkening back to Dante's anagogical mode, the big picture expressions in a narrative. Tolkien believes that the incarnation, I agree with him, the incarnation of Christ into the world is the place, the bleakest place, maybe not historically the bleakest place ever, but certainly bleak in the sense that humanity is lost. And into that darkness comes the hope of humanity, and that is in Christ. And Tolkien goes a step further. He says, within that moment of light and hope, the incarnation of Christ, the 33 years of his life on earth, especially the last 3 years of intense ministry, of highly focused ministry, Tolkien says that in that moment, there's also a mini moment of catastrophe in the crucifixion where it looks like all is lost, right? Anybody can be crucified, anybody can die, but not anybody can die for our sins, and furthermore, not anybody just rises from the dead. And nobody that I know of, even in the scriptures, has raised themselves from the dead. Certainly in the scriptures there are accounts of people being raised from the dead by a prophet or some outside external force, but nobody has risen from the dead on his own power. And Christ then becomes not a catastrophe, right, a sudden turn for bad, but Christ's resurrection is the eu, good, catastrophe, sudden turn. The eucatastrophe is the word that he coined to describe it. And Vaith's discussion of fantasy, it's more than that, right? It entails more about the fantasy genre, some of the wonder that it evokes. And it's not always wonder like, this is wonderful. Sometimes it could be wonder in kind of an awful wonder, like, this is alarming, right? Fantasy can raise that for us too in helpful ways. So I highly commend Vaith's discussion on fantasy. All right, so I'll be switching back and forth between my notes and the camera for Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Let me just go over some general points about the term rhyme, influences, things that may have influenced the composition of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and also Coleridge's view of the imagination in general. So the word rhyme, I think, is a play on words, and the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, probably the most relevant definition would be definition 1C, which is a figurative use of the word rhyme, chiefly with reference to age or antiquity. There's also an obsolete use of the word, maybe Coleridge had this in mind, in the idea of a reckoning or accounting, like a rhyming of something, the reckoning of the Ancient Mariner, or the accounting of the Ancient Mariner. And there might also be a play on the word rhyme as a crack or a fissure, the chink, the crack, the fissure of the Ancient Mariner, in addition to rhyme being associated with ice and iciness. So all of those words are, and all of those meanings, by the way, are available to Coleridge. So if Coleridge had access, he did have access to Johnson's dictionary. I don't know how much he may have consulted Johnson's dictionary. Samuel Johnson, the kind of the precursor to the Oxford English Dictionary. He made the most comprehensive English language dictionary until the OED came out. All of these meanings would be available to Coleridge, and perhaps these meanings are somehow embedded in what Coleridge is doing. Maybe the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is not just about the icy experience of the Ancient Mariner, or just about the reckoning of the Ancient Mariner, or just about the cracking of the Ancient Mariner, the fissure of the Ancient Mariner. Maybe all of these valences of meaning apply at one time or another. Maybe they don't all apply at the same time every time, but sometimes aspects of the word rise up. Now, as far as things that may have inspired Coleridge's composition of the poem, it may have been inspired by Captain Cook's voyage around Antarctica. In fact, Captain Cook's astronomer on that voyage was Samuel Taylor Coleridge's tutor, and I imagine it wouldn't be unreasonable to think he had talked to Samuel Taylor Coleridge about his experience sailing around Antarctica, or sailed into the Antarctic Circle. Thomas James is another voyager, and I don't know a lot about these. I'm not a historian of transglobal navigation. This just comes from teaching Coleridge's poem, but Thomas James was looking for a route to the top of North America, over the top, I think over the top of the globe, and his account may have been partially influential on Coleridge. And then there's George Shevlock. So as he was rounding Cape Horn, apparently his second officer shot an albatross, and that may have suggested to Coleridge this motif, right? The shooting of an albatross as a motif, not a theme, but a motif, to talk about the retribution for killing. That would be the theme. The motif, like the mechanics used to work out the theme, would be the shooting of the albatross. Perhaps there is some connection to the abolitionist John Newton, who nearly died on a slave ship, and maybe even some affinities with the legend of the wandering Jew or the Flying Dutchman. These arise around the 18th century, around the time, a little previous perhaps to when Coleridge is writing Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And the Wandering Jew and the Flying Dutchman are kind of like ghosts that appear on the ocean, and often are said by sailors to have come and visited ships. So those might be some influences, some contributors to the composition of the poem. Now, as far as theory and criticism goes, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I remember this from graduate school, I had to read his Literaria Biographia, which is an account of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theory of the imagination, among other things, theory of the imagination. And Coleridge, who was a contemporary of Wordsworth, he and Wordsworth actually worked together to write poetry. And Coleridge actually thought that Rime of the Ancient Mariner could be included in one of their collaborations. In any case, Coleridge believed, along with Wordsworth to some degree, that symbols are not just platters that you serve meaning on, right? They're not just correlative, right? You don't have a correlation between the symbol and the thing it's signifying. For Coleridge, whether you agree with him or not, the symbol itself is meaningful, right? It imparts meaning. So in the Lord's Supper, for instance, not getting into matters of whether we believe in transubstantiation, consubstantiation, real presence, or whatever, we're not going to get into that. But in the Lord's Supper, Coleridge might see the bread, using the bread as a symbol for the body of Christ, as meaningful in and of itself. To choose bread as a symbol is to imply life-givingness, nourishment. The wine as a symbol for his blood is not just like, oh, now I see the wine, I think about Christ's blood, and I leave the wine behind, but it also has the elements of sustenance, perhaps even joy, though blood is not often associated with joy. So Coleridge sees the symbol itself as highly meaningful. The symbol itself builds knowledge. It contributes to knowledge. So this is the backdrop against which Coleridge is presenting Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, Wordsworth, he thought that maybe Rime of the Ancient Mariner was a little too supernatural, perhaps a little too, maybe even a little too passive. The Ancient Mariner doesn't do much in the poem, and probably wouldn't fit in their lyrical ballads, right? The work that they had worked together on. Who knows exactly what happened, but perhaps a Romantic era scholar would know better than I would. I'm medievalist. In any case, to understand Rime of the Ancient Mariner, one has to keep in mind that this is not merely symbolizing a kind of experience, but the events described to us in the poem, which are very strange, are meant to be meaningful in and of themselves, or meaningful in ways that contribute to the overall understanding of the poem. So that the mariner stops a wedding guest is not just a symbol for stopping somebody's joy, but it's also the experience, the actual event of preventing this individual is a way of knowing, a way of building wisdom. If we were in class, we might have a little more time to develop this back and forth with the discussion. Nevertheless, keep that in mind as you go through these very strange events. Now, there are 7 parts in Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Let me touch on some highlights in each of the parts. In part 1, the everywhereness, the ubiquity of the ice is present to us after the mariner stops the guests from going to the wedding. And shooting the albatross may be symbolic of shooting or destroying life in a thoughtless way, or destroying life in a way that is that reveals lack of wisdom, lack of understanding, maybe even lack of experience. And that turn near the end of part 1, shooting the albatross, shows to us that the crew itself is fickle, right? The crew vacillate back and forth as to whether or not shooting the albatross was a good idea, and their judgment about it has to do with the situation of the boat. Is the boat moving along? Is it stuck in water? And the situation becomes the means by which the crew judges the action. And it is in part 2 that we see the slimy things introduced to us, and those slimy things will play an important part for the mariner's the mariner's revelation that all living things have value. Uh, Slimy things would be particularly important because having them there, those things themselves, push watchers away. To see slimy things in the water is to be repelled. Now, maybe, if you're a lover of eels or something like that, perhaps that isn't the case with you. But Coleridge is choosing something general to not merely to symbolize, but to enact the revulsion at life which looks repulsive. So from there, we have the death of the crew in part 2, and the ghostly game played in part 3 between death and life in death. Life in death wins the dice game, and the ghost ship. I think it's important to note that the ghost ship sails between the mariner's ship and the sun, and it's not an accident that the light from the sun comes through the ghost ship like bones and like bars, like prison bars. And so the mariner might be bound in prison. It's not merely symbolic for an individual whose actions have caused him to be in a tight spot. If it were merely symbol, we could recognize that, and then the experience doesn't matter. But to witness this in a supernatural way might suggest Coleridge's view that intervention is needed. And this intervention is an alarming intervention. And the alarming intervention of this ship is meaningful for reconciliation, a restoration of the Ancient Mariner himself. Now, it's also interesting, too, that in part 4, after the mariner drifts with his crew, he blesses, he blesses the slimy creatures, the snake-like creatures in the water, and that's when the albatross falls from his neck, giving him freedom in the pronouncement of something good for the things that were revolting. And the dead men, looking at the dead men around him, also enables the mariner to pray. And the mariner can't die. There are no signs of death on the crew. The mariner himself can't die. He's freed from his albatross when he blesses the snakes. Now, I don't know precisely what Coleridge is trying to say, like if there is a neat little packaged message here. Having read Literaria Biographia, or Biographia Literaria, rather, I suspect that Coleridge may have understood Rime of the Ancient Mariner to be capacious, right? Have a large capacity, much room for interpretation. Certainly you could get outside of that, of those boundaries, but the boundaries are set quite wide. So in part 5 we have the sound of wind and other sounds that move the ship along without a breeze. So there's only the sense of hearing without the sense of feeling. That, I believe that, along with some references to the Virgin Mary, is meant to signify a kind of Pentecost, a kind of coming of spiritual knowledge. Is it Christian spiritual knowledge? Knowing Coleridge, I suspect that plays a big part of the restoration of the mariner and his experience. In part 6, we have two voices talking together, which sound, to me anyway, sound like a discussion, the emphasis of which is on the penance paid by the Ancient Mariner. Now, is he going through a kind of purgatory? I don't know. He's definitely being purged of misconceptions. He's being purged of ill will in his shooting of the albatross, or even the revulsion he felt at the slimy creatures. And in the two voices talking together, after the two voices talk together, We have silence, which the mariner describes like music. And then he comes in contact with a boat piloted by a pilot and his son, I guess his boy is what he's called, and a hermit comes out with them. And the boat sinks. The hermit then forgives the ancient mariner of his sins, shrives him of his sins. The hermit is very enthusiastic. I'm kind of puzzled by this. I will admit to you, I've taught this for many, many years. I'm still puzzled as to whether or not the hermit has knowledge, or if the hermit is a vessel for revealing that the mariner has knowledge. Because there are times when I wonder, does the hermit really understand what's going on? In any case, I'm not sure that we'll come to the answer after reading this. In any case, he is instrumental in at least signaling that the mariner has been cleansed. So the mariner now feels this compulsion, right? We're in the last part of the story. He feels this compulsion to tell individuals his story. Not everybody all at once ever, but he has this impulse to go to certain individuals. And the wedding guest was one of those individuals. And we see at the end of the poem that the wedding guest doesn't go to the feast. He actually goes away, and he wakes up in the morning a sadder man, wiser and sadder. Now, sad doesn't mean despair and grief. Sad means serious. So in the 18th century, early 19th century, probably the primary meaning of sad would be sober, serious. And perhaps this embodies the idea of humble love. Now, one of the maybe difficulties in the poem is, well, the wedding feast imagery in Christianity is associated with Christ, and if the mariner is keeping the guest from the wedding feast, doesn't that really mean that the mariner is preventing the wedding guest from receiving salvation? If this were a pagan author or an atheist or an author who is antagonistic toward Christianity, I think that reading might be a valuable questionable reading to bring. But because it's Coleridge, a committed Christian, I think instead what perhaps he is doing is suggesting that attending the wedding feast or going toward the wedding feast might also come with a kind of ignorance, a lack of knowledge, or even the possibility that the guest is going to the wrong wedding feast. Not like, oh, he made a mistake and the wedding feast he was supposed to go to was 2 doors down, but in the sense that this is not the ultimate celebration you should be seeking. So that's another possibility for reading Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It is, as I have said, it's a difficult poem to understand on first read, but I think it's quite valuable in showing how experience itself becomes meaningful. It doesn't cause us to know, but it brings meaning to us that we can turn our attention to, we can bring our intellect to bear, our reason to bear on that experience, and then sift through it and see what we've learned from it. Let's turn our attention now to Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market. Now, Rossetti was highly influenced by Dante. In fact, her brother's name was Dante Rossetti, a pre-Raphaelite artist. Their family was, valued the poetry of Dante. So if you see maybe elements that we saw in Inferno, maybe creeping in or coloring, shading Goblin Market, that might be why. Now, Christina Rossetti was an Anglo-Catholic, meaning she practiced Anglicanism, but recognized the Catholic roots of her faith. She refused to marry. She was offered marriage by 3 different individuals. She decided to remain single, and then she was an abolitionist. Abolition of slavery. She opposed slavery. She opposed cruelty to animals, and most importantly for our poem, she was in opposition to the exploitation of women or girls in underage prostitution, and was a volunteer worker at St. Mary Magdalene's House of Charity in Highgate, a refuge for prostitutes, those who are seeking to escape from prostitution. So, Goblin Market is very, very much informed by Rossetti's passion for these topics. Some scholars see in Rossetti's Goblin Market something like a latent lesbianism, or things of that nature, but that requires ignoring this relevant, pertinent biographical information about her, not only her Anglican commitments, her Christian commitments, but also her work with these women on the margins of society. Indeed, the poem itself, the way it closes up with its emphasis on sisterhood and fruitfulness in marriage, I think really mitigates against that kind of what I would say is either a misreading of the poem or an appropriation of the poem for other ideological ends. So if you've heard that before, I want to be responsible enough to let you know that that view is out there. And if you've heard that before, you can consider it in light of the material in the poem and also in light of Christina Rossetti's own life experience. So Goblin Market is the story of Lizzie and Laura, two maidens, and I realize that it might be hard to keep Lizzie and Laura straight in your mind. So Laura is the one who eats the goblin fruit. Lizzie does not. Even when Lizzie at the end of the poem is being accosted by the goblin men in order to help her sister Laura, she still doesn't eat the fruit then at that time. Now, the narrative of the poem, I think, is very engaging. The rhythm of it, it's short lines. If you look at it on the page, it's a thinner column, which I think speeds the reading up. Just as a story with a plot, I think is quite interesting, keeps the reader's attention. But there are some maybe thematic points that we should consider. Consider that Laura, when she pays the price for the goblin fruit, so she's been seduced by the goblin men, when she pays the price for the goblin fruit, the price she pays is a part of herself, her hair, a lock of hair. If we stay with Coleridge's view of romantic view, kind of, it's his own view, but it's not unheard of amongst the romantic artists and poets and so forth. If we stay with his view that the detail of the lock is not just a symbol, cutting the lock is meaningful in and of itself, we would say that Laura is willing to have violence done to herself. Violence characterizes her desire to have the fruit of the goblin men. And who are these goblin men? Are they literal goblins? In the poem, yes, they are literal goblins, right? We could talk about the way they are described. Some scholars try to find in the description of the goblin men perhaps descriptions of people that would have been seen as exotic from distant parts of the world, whose physical features were remarkably different to an English audience. That may be the case. I think really what Rossetti is trying to highlight is these goblins represent a certain kind of man. Not that all men are goblins, but there is a certain kind of man who is best described in these terms. And yes, they can vary in their appearance, but at the core of their desire is the exploitation of these young maidens, and an exploitation that comes through deception. We have this fruit, it's going to be delicious, it's going to be great for you. And that deception is also kind of couched in a maybe a half-truth or something. The fruit is delicious to Laura. What she doesn't know is she's going to pay this heavy price for it, the price that leads her almost to death. And Lizzie, in her concern for Laura, uh, reminds Laura of their friend Jeannie. Jeannie also had an encounter with the Goblin Men, and Jeannie's subsequent life afterwards is described in terms of winter, death, literally death, lack of fruitfulness. And so the Goblin Men, they bring about, or they thwart generativity, they thwart not merely creativity, but they thwart fruitfulness, and specifically the bearing of children. And this is not a far-fetched idea given the end of the poem. If the end of the poem didn't have the moment of passing on motherly wisdom to children, maybe it would be a stretch. But I think that because the poem ends the way it does, the Goblin Men's fruit really is about barrenness. It's about lifelessness, about the ultimate end of their pleasures is futility. Even when Laura tries to, she has the kernel that she kept, and she tries to plant it in order to grow her own goblin fruit. We find that the fruitfulness of her planting of the kernel is thwarted. She has nothing in herself to lift her out of her, not only her despair, but also her wasting away. And it takes Lizzie's decision to go seeking the Goblin Men for the sake of her sister Laura and find the fruit so that she can bring relief to Laura. It's not until then that we find the restoration of fruitfulness to Laura. Now, we could say, and students often bring this up to me, they may ask, well, why is Lizzie going out and getting the goblin fruit, the very thing that made Laura sick in the first place? Isn't that foolish of her to do? So it may be foolish, but also Laura or Lizzie doesn't have the kind of background information that we do as readers of the poem. Lizzie inhabits the fairy, fantastical, romantical, not like romance, love romance, but the sense of wonderment world of Goblin Market. So she doesn't have the kind of meta knowledge that we have, and her motivation is to relieve Laura of her suffering, to relieve her of her stress. And I think Rossetti believes that motivation is not only is it efficacious, right, because Laura is cured by Lizzie's action, but it's also fitting and appropriate. And again, I point toward the end of the poem in the passing along of wisdom from mothers to children, where we find that sisterhood is a peculiar kind of fellowship that that can only be experienced among women. And I don't think Rossetti is trying to say no man can understand a woman, or that women can only ever understand each other. I think what she's trying to say is that there is a particular, maybe special understanding between women, among women, that can't be replicated in other kinds of relationships. And that Lizzie goes out and gets this fruit in an act of violence. That act of violence isn't merely, again, it's not merely a symbol for Laura recognizing, oh my goodness, I've gone too far, but it is it's the messy nature of their relationship, right? Laura has to eat the fruit or the globs of fruit because of the violence done to her by the Goblin Men. She has to eat that because relationships are messy, and to have an intervention where somebody, out of pity, in a desire to relieve pain and suffering, somebody might suffer themselves, might have difficulty in reaching out to that individual. And Laura and Lizzie's relationship and the events that happen to them in the poem are the reification of that, right? It is the performance of the ideas in Goblin Market. And as I said with Rime of the Ancient Mariner, there's plenty more going on in Goblin Market than this. I think it's worth noting the couple times that genie is mentioned. I think it's also worth noting the kind of symbols that are associated with Lizzie and Laura, things associated with purity, swans, lilies, even the little bower that Lizzie and Laura share together. This is after Laura has eaten the fruit. I think that is a foreshadowing, precursor, maybe even a revelation of the kind of fellowship, sisterly companionship that the poem is really built around or bestowed with. Let's shift now to Charles Dickens' The Baron of Grogzwig, which is a little mini episode in a larger novel called Nicholas Nickleby. And it's told I don't remember if it's on a train platform or actually in a train car, but these travelers are exchanging stories together, and one of the travelers tells this story, The Baron of Grogzwig. And it stands alone as its own narrative. It can be understood in isolation. It doesn't have special keys necessarily required in the Nicholas Nickleby narrative, right? It's not. I don't want to make it a throwaway in the novel, but it does stand by itself, and it continues this theme of the supernatural, which characterizes Romantic era literature. The preoccupations with knowledge. Can knowledge really be had only through observation, measurement, sensory means? Perhaps extrasensory or supernatural means are required in order to gain insights that are of ultimate value. The Baron of Grogzwig, most of the story is pretty much at the literal material level. It's kind of funny, the Baron with his, I think his Lincoln Greens, the men that he surrounds himself with, who are boisterous, reflect the typical bachelor life, free from cares, free from, maybe not free totally from cares, but free from obligations to others, which comes with marriage. And when the Baron gets married, of course, his life changes and leads him to that place of despair. And again, in a kind of maybe wry humor, we see the Baron almost mechanically thinking about killing himself, and that may be part of what the storyteller is emphasizing, right? The mechanical nature of the Baron's actions and thoughts. Maybe those aren't the best ways to think about the world. And it's only when he encounters the genius, which is another way of saying spirit. So genius in this case doesn't mean like, oh, he's very brilliant. It just means he's this, spirit being. The genius of suicide and despair shows up, and they have a comical exchange between the two of them. And I realize that in our own lives, perhaps we have been touched by suicide, and it is a heavy thing, not to be taken lightly. It still can be presented in narrative in this way, which emphasizes, I think, in the playing out of the narrative, emphasizes the absurdity of suicide as an action. Now, I don't think the Dickens story is trying to wag its finger in the face of those who feel such despair, who have been driven to suicide. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think what he's trying to do is show that in light of revelatory knowledge, one is potentially able to see the absurdity of trusting in perception. The Baron perceives himself to be in a bad spot, and it's only when the genius of suicide and despair says, look, get on with it, because I have to go meet a young rich guy later on, the Baron realizes, wait a minute, that young rich guy doesn't have a reason to despair. And in those, and he kind of there's a moment where he laughs. The Baron laughs, and the genius of suicide and despair is alarmed by it. He tells him, "Don't laugh." Laughter tends to break this spell of misperception. So there's no misperception about the genius being there. The misperception is that suicide is the right avenue. The genius does not care whether the Baron is thinking about this in rational ways or not. He just wants him to get on and to kill himself, because for him, that's the pragmatic outcome. And that, I believe, is a part of the thread running through the story, that if we rely on these practical or over rely on these practical ways of looking at things, we might find ourselves cornered into, or in the tower room or wherever the Baron is at, places where it seems these drastic measures are wise and they're not wise. And it has the typical happy ending, or a kind of typical happy ending, with the Baron living a long life, and even experiencing an addition to what he once thought was a burden, now becoming the birth of a new child, now becoming for him, it doesn't ease his burden, but it becomes, it's no longer a threat to him, no longer a reason to despair. And that brings us to our last fantastical story for this week, and that's Elizabeth Gaskell's Curious If True. Now, Curious If True is it's the story about a narrator who's looking for his relative, and his relative is John Calvin. Now, for those of us, I'm in the Reformed traditions. I go to a Presbyterian church, and John Calvin is a major figure in the church. So, it's equal opportunity for us to be picked on. So this character is looking for John Calvin. Elizabeth Gaskell grew up in a family that was very reform-minded, and may have even used its reform views to be somewhat abusive to her, and maybe even to her father, who experienced some hardships. I think he was a minister or something along those lines. Curious If True is about a narrator searching for his John Calvin roots. And this immediately presents to us the idea of status found in heritage. And I think Gaskell's story is going to undermine the pride the narrator has in finding some sort of link to this major theological figure. Now, again, if we're in the Reformed tradition, we can be irritated that she chose Calvin, but that's who she's chosen, so we'll go with her on that. Now, this character gets lost in a wood, and as literature readers, we've seen this before. We saw it with Dante, and in any literary story, if a character gets lost in the woods, immediately our metaphorical mode should tell us this character is not just physically lost, but the character is lost in other ways. So to be lost in the woods is like being, the lostness of being in the woods is particularly alarming. It puts one in danger of things that are unfamiliar, that are surprising. We have less control if we're lost in the woods, and that's where the narrator finds himself. But he stumbles upon this house, and this house seems to, have kind of this glow inside of it. And that glow, which emanates from, or seems to fill every place inside, or at least the room that they get to, that glow doesn't really have a source. It's just everywhere. That, I believe, is a signal that what the narrator is experiencing is something revelatory. And again, this is an interruption. Like the Ancient Mariner needed to have some sort of outside force breaking in breaking into his views, breaking into his thoughts. So this narrator has to have an outside force breaking into his assumptions about what's important. And he meets all of these fairy tale characters who are no longer in their ideal types of, in their ideal presentations. They have aged. Cinderella has put on a little bit of weight. The Puss in Boots, we find out he's actually kind of irritated at the guy that he's been helping out. Tom Thumb is a bit of a rogue and maybe a bit of a gossip too, and so on and so forth. And the narrator then finds himself confronted with a fairy tale whose reality is not what it seemed to be, is not the ideal that it seemed to be. And it could be signaling in the first instance with the narrator that maybe your roots linking you to Calvin are not as important as you think they are. Or maybe they're not good for you in some way. And so I think it's very clever how the narrative unfolds with the details from the fairy tale stories being kind of sprinkled into this dinner party setting that they're at. And also think too that the name John Calvin, or John, the name John, as a nickname, Jack is a possibility. And for the English, their fairy tale character that might attend this party would be Jack, the giant killer, Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack kills giants. John Calvin, Jack, killed giants. Maybe we could think of it as an attack against the giant of the excesses of the Catholic Church of the time. Some of its, absurdities. Maybe some people might go so far as to say the Catholic Church itself, but at least some of the absurdities of the Catholic Church are confronted by John or Jack, the giant killer. And it might work on another level where Jacques Jonquelier, which literally in French it means Jack the Giant Killer, the relative of the narrator, it might be a signal that this giant is being killed for the narrator, the killing of the importance of John Calvin as a relative. It doesn't negate the fact of it, right? If he's a relative of Calvin, that nothing can be done about that. But maybe the importance the narrator places on it is inappropriate or unfitting in some way. The culminating moment at the very end of the story is an exclamation that Madame Fairy Godmother has arrived. It's in French in the story. And then after that, the light is bright, and then the narrator wakes up. And I think it's especially important where he wakes up, the physical layout of where he wakes up. He gets lost in a dark wood, and he wakes up, which is symbolic for new knowledge, right? When we wake up in stories, when people wake up in stories, that can be a signal that they've acquired something, information that's helpful to them that they didn't have before. He wakes up next to a hollow oak tree with the light shining in his face. It's not a sturdy oak. It's not a blooming oak, an oak in full leaf. It's hollow. And I think the hollowness of the oak also echoes, I suppose, the idea that this narrator has been looking for the wrong things, has been placing the importance of his ancestry as something maybe that shouldn't be important at all. And the light in his face, that's another alarm bell. It's almost too obvious. The light in the face when he wakes up is a strong amplifier that he has gained knowledge, and that knowledge, maybe it's a divine type of knowledge. Maybe it is the real value found not in his heritage and his roots, but the real value needs to be sought elsewhere. It doesn't reveal what that real value is. What it reveals is the oak is hollow. The thing that you thought was sturdy is hollow. All right, so folks, that's my discussion for our readings this week. Again, touching on those elements. Our next dialogue post will be next week in week 7, and you can ask questions about any of these stories or week 7's stories, or indeed, if you wanted to look ahead and ask in week 7 about stories in week 8, you're welcome to do that too. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I will talk to you again another time. Bye-bye.